Hi, this is Brass and we're talking about the troubles at the border. And I want to give a little historical perspective on what's going on. To do that, we have to go back to the origins of the United States, and for better, well, for worse, the fundamental origin of the United States was one, land theft by murder from Native American people, and number two, bringing in enslaved African people to do the backbreaking work of building the country. Now, of course, a lot of other people were involved in building the country too, but the slave population obviously was a huge financial boost. When you don't have to pay people, millions of people to do work, it allows you to accrue a lot of capital. Remove those two things from the equation, and you don't have the level of prosperity that we've had in the last 200 years. So that's just fact. That's just the foundation of things. All this nonsense about people coming for religious freedom and all that is just that. It's just nonsense. There might have been a few, but most people came here involuntarily or because they were escaping incredibly desperate circumstances. That would include most Europeans who ended up here. They didn't come here for fun. Nobody leaves their home country for fun and adventure, unless they're backpackers and they plan to go home. To uproot yourself and go from one place to another language, another culture, another continent, you only do if things are really grim back home. But let's look a little bit at slavery. Slavery obviously was a big business. Many people got rich off it. Those who didn't get rich off it made a living from it. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Somebody had to kidnap the slaves. Somebody had to make the chains to secure them. Somebody had to run the prisons on the West African coast. Somebody had to transport them from the boats, from the prisons to the boats. Somebody had to take them across the ocean. Then somebody had to buy them on shore, hold them, and mark them up. Then somebody had to transport them to the various places where they were going to be worked. Then somebody had to manage them the entire time they were enslaved. So it was a very small percentage of Americans that actually owned slaves, but a significant percentage of people who were involved actively in the slave trade. And then if you talk about all the industries, peripheral industries, it becomes a massive part of our economy. And it was done for money. And the same biblical passage that Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions III quoted to justify what's going on at the border right now is the same passage that the Nazis used. They literally used it. You're to obey the government no matter what. Of course, he took it out of context. There was a lot of other commentary in that passage, but about loving people, love being the only law. But he took that out. As did the Nazis, and as did the philosophers and theologians and pastors, and there were many of them who justified the slave trade. There was a whole industry of people, just like Fox News. There was a whole industry of people who got up every morning, put on their suits, shined their shoes, combed their hair, and went out and told the population that God ordained slavery. Money, greed, human viciousness is what that business was about, and nothing else. I think that's obvious to most Brass Check listeners, but apparently there are some Americans that don't grasp that. If we want to look at another money grab in our nation's history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. They didn't intern illegal immigrants or even first-generation immigrants. Anybody with even a drop of Japanese blood, including infants. Now, they didn't separate infants from their families. They weren't that vicious. But anybody with even a drop of Japanese blood was interned. Turns out it was illegal. But it was, quote, justified supposedly at the time. And it was a famous Supreme Court judge, and you'll have to look it up, who was not a Supreme Court judge at the time, but became one, who put his stamp of approval on the order. And the order was put through, it was a California judge, by the way. This happened largely in California, where the vast majority of Japanese citizens, and these were American citizens, and they were more American than apple pie. I have photographs in my archive of Japanese people, dressed up in baseball, uniforms, playing baseball, playing in brass bands, owning and operating diners. I mean, these people were thoroughly Americanized. There was nothing, not that that would justify it, but there was nothing, foreign about them in any way. So why was it done? For safety, for security? No. Japanese people owned a lot of valuable real estate, both urban in San Francisco and throughout the state agriculturally. And one of the deals was you had to sell all your stuff before you were interned. What price do you think those people got on their farmlands and on their urban properties, their homes, their businesses, their office buildings? They were robbed. So the Japanese internment, like slavery, was purely money motivated by sick, greedy people in power who happened to have control of the PR machine, the public relations machine. And they have somehow managed to sell Americans on the idea that it was okay for your fellow citizens to be put in shackles, put on buses and trains, and sent to desert internment camps, concentration camps. So let's look at the let's look at another phenomenon in America, which is the fact that we have more, by percentage of population, we have more people in prison and in jail than any other country on earth. More than communist China, more than oligarchic Russia, more than any backwater in Africa or Latin America run by some crazy dictator. We have a higher percentage of people in prison than any other country in the world. If you're in prison on this planet, there's a 1 in 4 chance that you're in a U.S. prison. All right? I don't know what we make up anymore. It's a percentage of the population. It sure isn't a quarter. We've got about you could just do the math. We have about 300 million more, actually. Let's call it 3 billion people on the planet. All right? We'll just do the math. That's 1%. So 1% of the population, a country with 1% of the population, has 25% of the entire prison population. What's that all about? That's about money. One of the places that has a super high prison rate is California. And one of the reasons California has a super high prison rate is there's a prison guard union. And you can look this up and get to all the details. That prison guard union was taken over a couple of decades ago by a very ambitious guy, and he had a very simple plan to create job security and job growth for his members. He was going to criminalize every conceivable act you could imagine in the state of California, so that if you were poor and black or Latino and were arrested for something trivial, you were going to go to jail and or prison. It got so bad that at one point, even the San Francisco Chronicle, and I believe it was the LAPD. I mean, these are two of the most regressive organizations in the world. It got so bad that at one point even they said, hey, you're going too far here. But they, with their money, bribed California politicians, and California politicians cooperated and criminalized every conceivable act and made huge penalties for every conceivable offense you could imagine. And thus, California now spends more money on prisons than it spends on its college system for young people. Money. That's what's driving it. Money. The other place that has that's worth mentioning is Louisiana. Louisiana, the U.S. is the worst for incarceration. Louisiana is the worst of the worst. And within Louisiana, the worst of the worst is New Orleans. Is it any coincidence that the major slave market in the United States of America is now the place where black people are most likely to be incarcerated? So someone walking down the street, stopped by cops, found to have a joint in their pocket, literally, will go to jail and will not be bailed out. That's it. They're in jail until their hearing, which could be many, many months. So that's part of the reason there are so many people in jail there. People are incarcerated for ridiculous minor offenses, and many of them are too poor to bail out. A sensational case, but worth mentioning here, and we ran it on Brass Check when it happened. There were 2 judges in eastern Pennsylvania who had made a deal with a private prison, the owners of a private prison. They made a deal for which they were compensated, and their job was to put as many kids in prison as possible, into that prison as possible, and they did. So if you showed up with literally a skateboarding offense, if you had done graffiti, there was one child who showed up who had posted something unflattering about her teacher. Those were all jailable offenses. And unfortunately for these children, a lot of these kids showed up without attorneys or with incompetent attorneys, which is sort of goes without saying, and ended up in jail. Now, thank God, after many years of this, somebody caught on, and these 2 judges are now they're in jail for what they did. I hope they're having a good time. I hope they're really getting the treatment. But what was that all about? Well, that was obviously had nothing to do with law and order, had nothing to do with security. It had to do with money. Now, this is what's missing from the mainstream news reporting on this, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or CNN or anybody. They're not talking about the fact that this is a massive money play. And in that way, it's exactly like these 2 corrupt judges that sent children to jail for nothing. It's exactly like the fact that the U.S. has more people incarcerated than anyone else in the world, any other country in the world, for money. It's exactly like basically the theft of the land and businesses and real estate of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it's exactly like the slave trade. The form is different, obviously. All those things are different, but the motivation's the same. You use law and order and or security to justify the abuse and theft of other people's property. Now, in the case of slavery or the incarceration of the Japanese, the theft, you're stealing people's lives. And you're taking those lives and turning them into money. And I'm sure, and we're going to get to this in a second, I'm sure those internment camps were built by government contractors. And I'm sure there are people in the Pacific Northwest whose families can date their fortune to the building of those camps. And the building, and they were operated by the military. But when they say the military budget, you always got to realize that 90% of that budget is private contractors, arms manufacturers, or people providing services. I mean, you may not know, but let me tell you that in Iraq, soldiers did not do their own laundry. They were prohibited. They were forbidden from doing their own laundry. They had to turn it over, and I'm drawing a blank, but it's the company that was owned by Vice President Cheney. He had shares. He was a major shareholder before the war. And that company became the official laundry for the United States. And laundry was done at $100 per load. So even that alone, that one, quote, little business alone, multiply it by the number of troops and support personnel multiply that by the number of times your laundry has to be done in a year, and multiply that by 100. And that was just the laundry. And all that was privately made money. I digress, but you're getting the idea. If you hear about a military budget, what you're hearing about is politically connected people getting massive paydays. I remember I was teaching briefly at a college in Virginia long ago, and there was this one snot-nosed kid, this is back in the early 80s, who was bragging that his father was taking him and his friends to the Bahamas or someplace in the Caribbean for the weekend on their private plane. And this I think, people that are old enough to remember, that was a rare thing back in the 80s. It seems to be more common now, but that kind of travel was very, very, very rare. And his dad was a defense contractor. It's like, okay, I get it. Let's look at some reality about the immigrant crisis. Number one, the peak of illegal immigration was in 2006, and it was around 1 million people. The current number is somewhere around 300 million. So in relative sense, there is no crisis. There's a great reduction in the number of people crossing the border illegally. Why is that? Well, one of the big percentage of people that were coming to the United States were coming from Mexico. And the U.S. has become such an unattractive place economically for everyone, whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen, that Mexicans said, we might as well stay home. The place is a train wreck. So that's why the border crossings by Mexicans are down dramatically. The people that are coming from Central America, you just have to look at the history. We have participated in the destruction of civil society in Guatemala, in El Salvador, actively right now in Honduras, and we're trying to topple the government in Nicaragua again. That's an ongoing thing. We put absolute monstrous thugs into power. They destroy the society. They create chaos. They unleash, violent, horrific forces. And those countries are hellholes. I've been to them. The people are very nice. The level of danger is very high. In Guatemala, if you were a business owner and you have any kind of a profile at all, you have to have bodyguards 24/7. When you go out to lunch in Guatemala City, you'll see SUVs parked out front, and you'll see guys standing out in front of the restaurant, and they're all strapped. A Coca-Cola truck trying to make deliveries in Guatemala has to have, and I'm sure this is the same in El Salvador and Honduras, because those countries are even worse off, but I really only know Guatemala deeply. I've been to the other countries, but I've spent months in Guatemala. Someone has to literally ride shotgun. Somebody has to sit in the front seat of the truck with a shotgun and come out and supervise all the deliveries of Coke and all the cash pickups. That's how violent these countries have become. Not because the people are violent, but because the civil society has been destroyed. In the 80s and 90s, starting with Ronald Reagan, the military leaders, who were just frontmen for the rich people of the country, went on a program of genocide in Guatemala. The estimate is 200,000 plus people, largely indigenous people, were murdered in Guatemala by the military. You can look that up. They routinely track people down now at this point and send them to jail for their involvement in it. But in a country that only has less than 20 million people, 1% or more than 1% of the country was murdered, not put in jail like we do. We've got 1% of our population behind bars. They murdered 1% of their population. We armed them. We trained them. We gave our tacit approval to that. And you have similar things going on in El Salvador and in Honduras. Now, Nicaragua was a different story. They threw off Somoza. They ran their own system. We didn't like it, so we funded terrorists in the countryside because our terrorists weren't strong enough to fight in the city, so we had them do their operations in the countryside. And what were their operations? Destroying clinics, medical clinics, destroying bridges, destroying food processing facilities, and murdering peasants. Terror. It was a war of terror, and the idea was to turn the Nicaraguan people against their own government. Now, I'm not a huge fan of socialism, but sometimes when a country's back is to the wall, they have to take drastic means. And when countries have been so massively corrupt for so long, as Nicaragua was, you really have to reset things. And the Nicaraguans were doing their best to reset things. And it involved building up the countryside. It involved building schools. It involved building medical clinics. It involved building food processing, which is so important to people that are rural farmers. And they used their resources to do that. And what did we do? We destroyed that, and we terrorized the people who were trying to do those programs. So that's what our government did. So when we look at most of the people coming to the border these days, especially those applying for refugee status, are from those countries. You know, when you look at the oceans of people trying to cross into Europe from Syria, from Tunisia, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, well, why are they leaving their countries? Because their countries have been destroyed. Who did that? Yeah, those countries weren't ideal. They weren't perfect. They were highly messy before we got involved. But people stayed home. People had lives. People could survive. So we created this problem, and now we're brutalizing the people that have the problem that we created. That's what's going on. By the way, this is obscured, but it's slowly coming out. The process of coming to the United States and applying for refugee status is not a crime. It's a procedure. It's a civil procedure. You come, you apply, and you may be approved, in which case you can stay. You may be disapproved, in which case you're deported. It's not criminal to come here and apply. Many of the families that have been separated with the children taken away from their mothers, infants, nursing infants, toddlers, it boggles my mind that anybody can look at that and not see evil. And apparently 50% of all self-identifying GOP members believe that this is a correct policy. We got a lot of sick people in this. That's stuff we got to face. We have a lot of sick individuals in this country. And it's interesting to me. They always have to go to a diner somewhere in the middle of nowhere where they talk to some, poorly educated, half senile idiot about his or her opinion about how life should be in America. And then that's somehow balanced against the issue of, do you separate infants from their parents? Remember, even if they have crossed the border illegally, they've committed a misdemeanor. This is not a federal offense. This is not a criminal offense. I mean, it's a criminal offense, but it's a misdemeanor. And let's look at some other basic numbers. This is being sold. This whole policy is being sold with lies. So when they say only 3% of the people that are released to come back for a hearing show up, that's a lie. Over 75% come back. Is that a perfect number? No, but it's not 3%. And a lot of the people that don't come back, they move, they don't get noticed properly, they live in chaotic conditions, they plan to go home eventually anyway. They're afraid to come back. They figure, hey, we're looking at the news. We shouldn't have anything to do with these people. I'll tell you a personal experience that I had. I have a good friend from Russia, and he came here. He had refugee status because he left the Soviet Union. He had all his paperwork. He had permission to work. He worked as a house cleaner, his own business, worked hard, he and his wife. He was able to bring his wife over. Took 2 years, but he was able to do it. He went in to check in at the immigration, and they messed up his paperwork. There was a mistake that they made. So what did they do? They handcuffed him to a radiator for 8 hours, and then they put him on a bus. This was San Francisco. Then they put him on a bus to Los Angeles, and then he was put in a prison. And then he was shipped from Los Angeles to Phoenix, or Tucson. And he was in prison for 6 months. He had followed every law, every rule. He'd done everything correctly. And they had made a paperwork mistake, or someone had made a paperwork mistake. And this is pre-9/11, by the way. Okay, there was no Russian crime wave even at that time yet. This was just a garden variety legal immigrant jailed for 6 months because a bureaucrat made a paperwork mistake, and nobody anywhere in that chain of events had the intelligence or the integrity or the decency to listen to him and sort it out. So he lost 6 months of his life in prison. That's the nature of these people. That's how immigrants or people that are not American citizens who are here working or living are treated routinely. This has been going on since the beginning of time. There's no difference. If you have ancestors that came here, I guarantee they were abused as well. But anyway, 75% or more of the people who are supposed to come to hearings come to their hearings. That's a pretty high percentage. If you compared it to Americans, it wouldn't be much worse. So to say that 3% only shows up is a blatant lie. We already know that it's a blatant lie that there's a crisis on the border. Okay, I don't know what these senile, poorly educated idiots down in Arizona are talking about. The numbers are down from 1 million to 300,000. The peak was over 10 years ago. The situation is getting better all the time. Okay, unfortunately, we destroyed Central America, and we're now getting the blowback from that. Had we not done that, the numbers would be trivial. So what other numbers are important for us to know? Money is the number that we need to know. If somebody is arrested or they're applying for refugee status, asylum status, you can jail them or you can release them on their own recognizance. That happens every day in America. People commit crimes and they're allowed to bail out, or they're just allowed to go and come back for their hearing. It's normal. There's nothing unusual about it. If you want to keep track of these folks, make sure they show up, you can put an ankle bracelet. Ankle bracelet on. The cost to do that, which is highly inflated, but still, it's what it costs, is $6,000 a year, about $500 a month. And you can break that down, how much that is per day. It's not much. You put that on, and you can find, you tell them you're under house arrest, you can't leave town, you can't leave this neighborhood, and show up at your hearing. And you will get high level of compliance. It'll be in the upper 90 percentile. That costs $6,000 a year. Now here's the point of this whole rant by me. What do you think it costs to house a child in one of these internment facilities? Okay. You may already know, but let's compare. So we have $6,000 divided by 365 equals $16 a day. Is that right? 16 times 365. Yeah. So the ankle monitor costs $16 a day. Families stay together. Children aren't traumatized. You know, the head of the U.S. American Pediatrics Association, all the doctors that take care of children, came out. He visited one of these places, and he flatly said, "This is child abuse." Now, usually when an authority says something, the news media falls all over itself, making sure that everybody hears it, especially if, you know, that person's trying to sell something. But this little blip of news came and went, gone. But the person arguably with the most authority in this country on the well-being, the medical well-being of children, states unequivocally that this is child abuse. This is done in no other country. The Chinese don't do it. The Europeans don't do it. The Russians don't do it. Nobody does this except slave traders. And I'm going to read a quote in a second from somebody that traveled in the land of slave traders in Africa, and what he had to say about what he saw. And you see if it's any different than what's going on in the United States right now. So we now have that number, I think it was $16 a day for an ankle monitor. It costs $670 a day to intern a child, a kidnapped child kidnapped from its family in a U.S. internment camp. $670 a day. $670 a day. And if you have your calculator out, that's $244,550 per year. So every time you see one of those children, and they want to add to that, they want to put more in, it's $244,550 per day. This is a money thing. Just like slavery, just like the internment of the Japanese, just like the mass incarceration of American citizens, this is a money thing. People are getting rich off of this. When you hear that the military is going to build, is going to pitch in and build camps, you need to hear it this way. Military, politically connected military contractors who have already been on this for years are ready to spring into action and cash in. Because they're the ones that are going to be building these things. They're probably going to be doing 90% of the operation. So it's not the military doing this. It's the politically connected military contractors that are going to be doing this. So we had private prison companies. Their stock prices are through the roof, obviously. The business is so big that it's outstripping even their greed. And the defense contractors, the greediest of all, the most corrupt of all, they're getting into the business. And guess who is a major lobbyist for private prisons and people that build private prisons? Corey Lewandowski. Now, who's Corey Lewandowski? Well, he is a bagman for Donald Trump. He's been Donald Trump's close advisor from the beginning. He was invited by the sick U.S. news media to represent Trump on Fox and CNN. And now he's the chief cheerleader for this incarceration scheme. Corey Lewandowski. And he receives money as a lobbyist every day from people that operate private prisons who are making and stand to make vast fortunes from this new mass internment scheme. So this is slavery days all over again. You're making money by stealing people's lives. That's what's happening. Nothing else. And what boggles my mind is nobody's talking about the dollars and cents here. CNN's not talking about it. Well, obviously Fox, they're the biggest cheerleaders for this imaginable. But even maybe I'm missing it, but I'm not seeing a lot of alternative media just pointing out that this is a money thing. The people, this is all this stuff about security and safety and law and order is a smokescreen. The discussions of justice and human rights are not a smokescreen, but as important those issues are, we have to face that this is a money grab. This is a blatant money grab by criminals who happen to be in the government. I want to read a quote for you. These unfortunate and distracted lands where the traveler every day has to observe domestic happiness trodden underfoot, children torn from the breasts of their mothers, and wives from the embraces of their husbands. What is he describing? He's describing the USA 21st century. But actually, this fellow Heinrich Barth was in Africa in the 1850s, traveling through the rural areas of Africa that were ravaged by the still thriving slave trade. Let me read it again. These unfortunate and distracted lands where the traveler every day has to observe domestic happiness trodden underfoot, children torn from the breasts of their mothers, and wives from the embraces of their husbands. He was describing a completely vicious and chaotic situation in rural Africa during the slave trading times. And you could take those same words that he used in 1850 and apply them to what you see on the television every day in 21st century America. So we're not under threat. Yeah, we need to be more intelligent about how we handle the borders. Some of the laws can definitely use a second look and possibly reform. That's true. Every country has this problem, not just the United States. Canada has people sneaking in. England has people sneaking in. All countries have this problem. They don't solve it by taking children from their families and incarcerating children in horrific situations. It's being done for money. And there's just no other way to look at it. Trump personally is only 2 steps removed from the money. You've got the private prison owners, you've got Corey Lewandowski, and you have Trump. Now, Obama and before him Bush and certainly Clinton before him all created the foundation for what we're seeing today. So the fact that Trump is a loathsome human being, I think goes without saying. Anybody that doesn't get that is addled. But he is only using the weapon that he was handed by Barack Obama and by George Bush Jr. and by Bill and Hillary Clinton. So let's put blame where it's due. It needs to be spread out evenly among all the government criminals. But this is a money thing. It's a money thing. It's a money thing. It's a money thing. It's a money thing. It has nothing to do with security. It has nothing to do with law and order. They could achieve the same end by putting ankle monitors on these folks for, I think we said $16 a day. Instead, what are they doing? They're taking children from their parents and putting them in federal incarceration facilities for $670 a day. Private companies are getting that money. Those companies are giving money to lobbyists, and those lobbyists are giving money to politicians, and that's why this is happening. There's no other reason, and it's bizarre and disgraceful to me that this is not the news and that that everything else under the sun is being discussed, but the pure, simple fact that this is a money grab is being ignored. So that's that. I hope you found this illuminating. Do your own research, of course, always. You don't have to believe anything I say. Use your own common sense, and try to help if you've got family members or neighbors, and if you've got the stomach for it, try to educate them. It is pathetic to see American citizens cheering this thing or saying, oh, it's an unfortunate necessity. It's not a necessity by any length. The problem could be solved literally tomorrow, and it won't be, because it provides all kinds of political fodder and income to lots and lots of people. That's Brass Check.